So I guess this topic, Brian actually, I think, originally sort of prompted or asked a question that prompted me to put this here, which is basically, hey, you have like 4 different projects that you, or actually, Brian knew of 2, but there are 4 different projects that either consume or produce BGP implementations, and there is no common. None of them do it together. There is no shared infrastructure to talk about like the BGP in OpenDaylight, and so it would seem useful to get to the point that there was a single BGP service that could have different implementations if you wanted to. You could back it using the internal one. You could back it using Quagga if you wanted to. I'm not an expert on. Well, I'm not an expert on BGP, and I'm really not an expert on our implementations. But so I don't know why you would choose one or the other. But I do. But it does seem like there would be advantages to trying to get a single BGP service and being able to launch that and be able to everybody reference it, as opposed to sort of literally having 4 different projects doing 4 different things with BGP in 4 different ways. And I don't know if we have representatives for all those projects. I tried to ping all the projects. So we have your VPN service or NetVert, right? That's sort of, so Daya is here. Giles, do you pretend to represent?
I can see to represent bgpcep. Also SDNI.
I know that's a different problem than the rest of them.
What I remember, they just copied the bgpcep code.
It's worse than that. Yeah. So this is just, so in this case, like, just needs to work with bgpcep to get off their fork.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I guess my startup attempt would be, clearly things like Quagga have been around longer, potentially more stable, yeah. But I guess the particular challenge we're going to have is that, from an ODL perspective, what we're looking for is a Java implementation of the YAML file. My knowledge is only one of those. I struggle to see how we choose, for example, a BGP service where we back up another BGP implementation, because then we have to map from YAML to map YAML models, and also the issue it would by definition then be an external implementation, so we have to somehow bring in something outside the JVM. Now that's not to say you can't do it, but does that make it more complex?
And so, yes, but the question is sort of, right, people are already doing this, right? I mean, there's already some API defined from Java code that these applications are using that is going out to talk to Quagga, right? So they've already done they've already written some translator. The question is, could they write that translator underneath a generic BGP service so that way it was at least moderately reusable, as opposed to writing it as a custom thing? Does that make sense? So do we have mics? So this is being recorded. So the good part is that if we actually use mics, there were mics in the room. But I can repeat things for a second now. So I think basically, so what Dio said was basically right now the VPN service or the NetVert service uses Thrift to talk to Quagga, and they use that in part because they need performance requirements. And so using Yang, you would just have to make sure to keep, if you're going to use Yang as a different interface than basically as an alternative to Thrift, you would need to make sure that the performance was reasonable. And I think it was like something like 3,000 updates a second, and Giles is pretty sure that's reasonable. Yeah.
So
it is almost comparable to like route implementations, Mark implementation.
So the 2000 routes a second is what it was an end-to-end KPI that I was talking about, where we get routes from the BGP and program them all the way down the OpenFlow plugin down to the switch.
If you do flow-by-flow programming, you use REST calls to program that?
No.
What do you do?
On the controller?
Yeah,
That's
on the
Thrift.
controller.
That's Thrift.
So you implemented a Thrift interface?
Thrift interface,
And
yeah.
then how do you interact with the OpenFlow plugin?
Through MDSAL. So
But,
that goes through MDSAL.
Are you issuing
in a
RPCs
clustered-
or are you going through the data store?
Through the data store.
Okay, so
Yeah.
2000 is about the right thing if you do individual flows. If you try to batch the flows, your performance will go up dramatically. If you try to do
Yes.
RPCs directly, your performance will go up dramatically.
Yes.
So it depends how you use the OpenFlow plugin.
Yes. So we have, we are working on that, on increasing the throughput on that interface.
So two things to consider there. Do batching. So try to program multiple flows at once in any given transaction. That increases the throughput of the data store quite a
Correct.
bit. I mean, you'll see that.
Correct.
Alternatively, rather than going through a data store, use RPCs directly to the OpenFlow plugin.
Exactly. So the point is, today we have seen that the data store is a bottleneck to achieve these KPIs, and the Thrift interface so far has not been a bottleneck for us.
The Thrift is not an
So
issue. It's the data store.
Yeah. So if we move to a Yang-based interface, then we have to think about the MDSAL performance again. Yeah.
Yang will not impact the performance, or RESTConf or whatever, end-to-end Yang will not impact the performance in any which way. I mean, it's really the data store transactions that are the bottleneck.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, if we talk about BGP goes to maybe something like 20,000 updates per second at this point.
Yeah, we can do something about 25 to 30,000 updates a second.
Is this? Are you running it in a cluster, 3-node cluster?
No, currently no. So currently, and this is a problem of the mic. And this is actually a problem within how the cluster database is implemented. The core problem is that with BGP you get a lot of repetitive data, and so when we replicate it, we lose the fact that it is repetitive, and on followers it kind of explodes the memory usage. So that's why we don't really support it currently. There is actually a test for this kind of scaling, but I haven't seen it pass for quite some time, but it's definitely something to work for, right? But on the other hand, I'm not sure whether Quagga does BGP replication the same way, because for BGP you can really do the replication using BGP by having multiple peers, right? And you can peer with each of the node of the cluster, and you achieve HA that way. And at that deployment, again, we are doing 25,000 or 30,000. I remember, I don't remember the exact numbers, but we can converge 1 million routes in something like, I think, 40 seconds or something.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the cases, I guess, where I'm coming at this as a network guy, and I would always say use the protocol. And so the way I would see it, or the right approach, is to say, well, as Robert says, run a BGP peering to each node in the cluster, but then run those peerings from a pair of external BGP speakers that are configured to be redundant. So then you've kind of, you don't need to worry about using internal clustering mechanisms to get the data there. And I guess I would say, if you're saying, well, Yang's too slow, then the question, it does sort of beg the question why you're an ODL at all. If you know what I mean. If Yang's too slow for BGP...
We've been saying that for a long time.
But you know what I mean? If Yang's too slow for BGP, surely it's too slow for OpenFlow. So I think the issue is we have to solve that problem across both of them rather than putting one in and one out.
But the point is, Yang is not slow, because I mean, you actually get compiled versions of the Yang objects. So OpenDaylight is very different from any other model-driven system in the world. which are mostly interpreted, so they interpret the XML schemas or what have you. It is a compiled schema model.
Yes.
Like the models are really compiled into Java code, and the Java code executes at Java speed. So you know.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean Yang necessarily in the pure sense. What I meant is the MD-SAL clustered. It's the clustering that basically.
The data store in general
data store,
is a is a bottleneck and would be and will be in any other system, any other data store. And by the way, we are doing something about improving the data store throughput. We can talk about it. We did have a talk earlier, I mean yesterday, about about the work that is being done, and we can talk and brainstorm. I think it's on the program, on the agenda, on how to progress further. But the data store is something that performance absolutely needs to be addressed.
So I think the two ways to sort of get this conversion. One is the performance and KPI numbers, and the other is functionality and features, right? I'm not sure, we haven't kept up with the work that happened in the boron cycle, and I think we had a to-do to sync up on that, but we do have requirements for VPN functionality, EVPN, as well as layer 3 VPNs, and I'm not sure if that is...
Yeah, that's there in boron. I guess the only functionality that you'd say that ODL is sort of missing at this point is probably around some of the policy type stuff, which again can be solved with an external BGP speaker. So in terms of AFI-SAFIs, pretty much everything, I can't imagine there's anything there you need, anything not there that you need. If there is, then adding an AFI-SAFI is relatively straightforward for us. So we'd probably just take it that way. But I can't imagine you're missing, we have EVPN, we have IPVPN, we have v4, v6 unicast and flow spec, we have labeled unicast, and we have link state.
Okay.
So if that set doesn't satisfy you, we can figure out what it takes to put something else in.
Okay, we can, yeah.
And so, Brian, since you were the person that sort of originally kicked this off, is this productive for you? Like, I mean, Brian? So so I'm sort of curious. I mean, so it sounds like if we could solve the clustered data store performance, we could imagine using the OpenConfig Yang data models as an interface down to Quagga, in which case we also use the OpenConfig interfaces down. We're moving to using OpenConfig interfaces down into the BGPcep implementation. It's like, I think it's 80% of the way there. As the dominant interface to those, and that would sort of end up with both of these things sitting underneath the same interface. At which point, then presumably it's interchangeable, and you could move it back and forth. Albeit there's going to be features that are present and missing in different ones, and you're going to have to deal with that. And is that sort of so and that seems productive. Like it seems like it would get us to the point at which we don't have we would share some common debugging and tooling around BGP, but. Is that, so do we think that's a productive thing to go do? Is that not worth the effort? Is it?
I would have some concerns because I'm guessing that in your use of Quagga, you're effectively configuring Quagga separately, and then you're basically having Quagga stream the routes in, and basically to implement this thin layer that then goes off to Quagga, actually the layer's probably not that thin because you'd have to map from each of the sort of fields in OpenConfig through into Quagga configuration. And then,
so we configure the Quagga as well through the Thrift interface. So the northbound is exposed through ODL.
And that's all
through REST. Yeah.
And all the configuration knobs you need for Quagga are exposed through Thrift, are they?
Through REST on the ODL side, and then we configure the Quagga through Thrift. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
So we've added a Thrift plugin to Quagga.
So I guess that would only be the question then: is what's the effort to do all of the, because clearly you'll be configuring what you need to configure. So I guess my question is, how much work do you think it is to configure it, be able to configure everything in Quagga through that, or everything that's exposed in OpenConfig anyway? That seems like quite a lot.
Well, it wouldn't necessarily have to be everything that's exposed through OpenConfig so much as the things which you actually use, right? You could have stub code that was dead, right? And it would be annoying. At some point, it's going to bite you, but in the short run, it would be better. It might be better than having two totally different code paths.
Well, but sorry, I came in late. So my key question here is that ingesting those routes is just the first step, because in order to actually execute anything, you really need to build up your local RIB model, right? And then once you have that routing information there, having run your best path selection algorithm, what have you, actually built up the local RIB, then you can do decisions. Now, the BGP PCEP implementation does all of that, and it does have a Yang model of local RIB. So the simplest way to integrate, if you're already sitting inside the controller, is instead of having peering to a BGP peer, configure the BGP PCEP stack to do the peering and do all of that selection and stuff for you, and just hook onto the data store to that particular RIB instance and ingest that data as it is processed, right? And at that point, it's really microservices. Here's RIB input, it's widely available, and I choose to do this and this with that input. I'm not sure whether that is something that we're discussing. I'm sorry.
We leave the RIB inside the Quagga, and it's just the FIB that gets populated in the ODL. There's no best path computation happening within ODL beyond that. But that it could be achieved.
Right. So the second question, I guess, is then, are there any projects which could benefit from calculating the FIB, given that we already have the RIB, from calculating FIB inside controller and ingest that? Because yes, the BGP PCEP implementation does not really have a data plane currently, so it doesn't calculate FIB, but that may be a useful project.
Yes.
You kind of need to calculate a FIB based on technology. I mean, the FIB is going to look like different for IP or different for OpenFlow, right? And you can actually plug in things like the VPP or the FDIO underneath, and either use directly the FDIO APIs or use netconf to program VPP with the route with the FIB.
Yeah, so maybe what you're saying is what, again, being a network guy and not a software guy, I don't know what the performance impact of this would be, but yeah, could we build an abstract FIB API, as it were, that then could be implemented using OpenFlow or using netconf VPP?
Or utility clusters. I don't know. We would have to. So I don't know what exactly would be useful. So if and what the intersection of the technologies really is that go in and calculating that FIB, but it does feel like that would be something useful for multiple projects, because obviously routing information is important to pretty much everyone.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, so we spin up a FIB project.
VPN, VPN awareness, and so how do we go ahead? I mean, do we come out with a set?
Yeah, exactly. So it would be a point of the different BGP and anything else that wanted to generate a FIB would write to this, would have to have a way of writing to this API, and then you would have to build renderers for each of the things southbound of it.
So does that end up looking a lot like forwarding rules manager?
So just a sec. When I'm saying RIB information or other data model, it already includes BGP-LS, which means that the OSPF and IS are included in that model. Maybe we need to refactor it to make that more explicit. But essentially, when I say we do have local RIB, we do have BGP-LS, and that implicitly implies IGPs too.
So I guess I have two questions. One of them is sort of a FIB service. How different is that going to be than the forwarding rules manager? Which is OpenFlow specific right now, but wouldn't necessarily need to be. Like, right? It's.
So I'm just thinking in terms of, I guess it's probably the same for the OpenFlow one, but yeah, so you need to be able to generate a FIB for each of multiple forwarding plane devices.
Which I guess, which the forwarding rules manager
does. Yeah. I guess the other thing is that we would presumably want to be able to generate multiple FIBs per device because of, for example, VPN. You'd generate a FIB for each VRF.
And that
then
can be
you
done
have
with a virtual
ECMP
device, right?
type,
Is there a reason why you need that? Is that a reason that isn't just another device from our perspective?
It kind of is, but then you have the overlay thing between them, so we just have to make sure we pick the right model, yeah.
I'm sorry, sorry, go ahead.
Well, there's just features like multipath ECMP that need, probably not there in the FRM right now.
Yeah, that's a good point, because the OpenFlow stuff's probably more connection orientated generally, and we're looking for something that's more connectionless in general.
But that's not fundamental. That's just generally how it's used, right? Like, I don't think that's actually, like, there's nothing fundamentally connection-oriented about the forwarding rules manager. It happens to be that usually you program flow rules into it, right? As opposed to, like, you know, routing rules. But there's no reason why you couldn't put, like, you know, a prefix match out a port in the forwarding rules manager. In fact, lots of people do, which would be.
Yeah, I mean, that is how we instantiate, effectively it translates one-to-one from the FIB to OpenFlow rules. But yeah, I mean, you need some sort of grouping, right, for ECMP routes, and that grouping is not there in the FRM directly right now.
So you would need grouping.
Yeah.
So, okay, so my second question that I have, and sort of I think we're actually like 2 minutes after time for this topic, is this worth doing? I mean, like, which is, and you know, I mean, and this is where I'm going to somewhat punt to Brian since he asked the question, but I mean, like, do we, and maybe I can get Brian's attention, we'll see. But like, is this worth doing? I mean, so I think we had put a path together, which is basically how could we essentially migrate things to the point at which you could use either the internal bgpcep or Quagga with some relatively significant amount of work. I mean, you're going to need to write an open config some kind of translator from an internal model, which is probably openconfig, to configure Quagga in the ways that you need to do it, and then sort of map that up. Or we could peer with, you know, Quagga using bgpcep, and we could get this FIB. And I think both of those seem useful. But is it worth? I mean, so is it worth doing? Is there a problem that we have right now that would be like, or is it just? I mean, that's sort of my question, and I don't really know the answer. It seems like there is at least aesthetic value in having everything in one place, but
I bet there is also operational value to having not two boxes but one.
Yeah, and you could actually query the RIB all in one place. So this seems useful. And are there any? I mean, I think we have a lot of good notes here. Hopefully I took enough of them. And Brian, what was your? I mean, so do you have anything you want to add?
I will have to pass this to the real Brian Freeman. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Because it wasn't my question. It must have been his.
Okay. Sorry. Oh, I had the wrong Brian in my head. You're right. Sorry, no, that all makes sense now. So, okay, I will pass this back. But I mean, hopefully, that in retrospect, that explains a lot more things.
Hindsight is 2020.
So anyway, so.
I've heard this being discussed in discussion, right?
But yeah, sorry. Yeah, fair enough. So anyway, so I think that at least we have some good notes and a place to start. Whether or not we prioritize it for Carbon is another question, but and I think that there's 5 minutes before I'm supposed to lead the next thing, sadly. So are there any last minute things you want to add?
Just one correction there. We don't use the FIB from Quagga. The FIB is built within the network VPN service. Just the second point over there. The RIB is in the Quagga, but yeah.
How do you compute the FIB then?
That's all. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's are you running one? Are you running one? Okay. Fair enough. Okay.
So the question becomes: can we feed the RIB from bgpcep, and then whoever calculates the FIB calculates the FIB?
Yeah, that should be possible, as long as.
And that should be pretty straightforward, I think.
Straightforward, yeah. Instead of, should be straightforward. I think the discussion is more of, feature completeness, which you seem to have, and performance. I think we need to really have good,
Yeah, it seems that adding Office is way easier for OpenDaylight than Quagga.
Cool. So I think there's a 5-minute break here where I can go try and find a plug and people can get coffee. So in this case, like, just needs to work with bgpcep to get off their fork.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I guess my startup attempt would be, clearly things like plug out or being around longer, attention more stable, yada, yada, yada. But I guess the particular challenge we're going to have is that from an ODL perspective, what we're looking for is a Java implementation of Unifying. To my knowledge, there's only one of those in the world. That kind of, I struggle to see how we could produce, for example, a BGP service where we back up with another BGP implementation, because then we have to map from Yang to, map Yang models, and also the issue will by definition then be an external implementation, so we have to.
I'm not an expert on well, I'm not an expert on BGP, and I'm really not an expert on our implementations. But so I don't know why you would choose one or the other. But I do. But it does seem like there would be advantages to trying to get a single BGP service and being able to launch that and be able to everybody reference it, as opposed to sort of literally having 4 different projects doing 4 different things with BGP in 4 different ways. And I don't know if we have representatives for all those projects. I tried to ping all the projects. So we have your VPN service or NetVert, right? That's sort of, so Daya is here. Giles, do you pretend to represent?
I can see to represent bgpcep. Also SDNI.
I know that's a different problem than the rest of them.
What I remember, they just copied the bgpcep code.
It's worse than that.
So I would consider that one.
Yeah. So this is just.
Somehow bring in something outside the JVM. Now that's not to say you can't do it, but does that make it more complex?
And so, yes, but the question is sort of, right, people are already doing this, right? I mean, there's already some API defined from Java code that these applications are using that is going out to talk to Quagga, right? So they've already done they've already written some translator. The question is, could they write that translator underneath a generic BGP service so that way it was at least moderately reusable, as opposed to writing it as a custom thing? Does that make sense?
Well, it does, and I think open config seems to be the way that you guys are going.
Yeah. So we have a grid-based interface into an external Quagga. But that grid interface today is inside the network project, and we could very easily pull that out and put it in the common service interface. The problem with going to a full YAM implementation for common service, we have a very stringent KPI requirement that we are processing. I think today at about 2-3K routes a second, but we have requirements to make that scale a lot more. So going with an open config in a clustered setup. So going with a full YAM, configuration, BGP configuration via YAM should be fine, but the route exchanges between the ODL applications and the BGP engine, those need to be sort of a high performance interface.
Yeah, but I don't think 2,000 or 3,000 updates a second is scale of the
So I guess this topic, Brian actually, I think, originally sort of prompted or asked a question that prompted me to put this here, which is basically, hey, you have like 4 different projects that Brian knew of 2, but there are 4 different projects that either consume or produce BGP implementations, and there is no common. None of them do it together. There is no shared infrastructure to talk about like the BGP in OpenDaylight, and so it would seem useful to get to the point that there was a single BGP service that could have different implementations if you wanted to. You could back it using the internal one. You could back it using Quagga if you wanted to.